Welcome to Roots of Representation, a podcast series brought to you by Knology, a leading organization creating practical social science for a better world. The podcast series is a part of our larger National Science Foundation-funded project called Black Rep for Kids, where we delve into the power of storytelling in helping young Black children prepare for and tackle the challenges of climate change. If you're interested in learning about how we can build a brighter climate future for Black children, their families, and their communities, you've come to the right place. Let's get started with Roots of Representation, the podcast centering Black climate story worlds for young minds. Welcome to Roots of Representation, Black-centered climate story worlds for young minds. Our guest for this episode is Arthur Affleck, Executive Director of the Association of Children's Museums, or ACM for short. Arthur has considerable experience in nonprofit work and higher education, and most recently served as Executive Vice President at the American Alliance of Museums, where he led an array of programs and services. Arthur Affleck, welcome to Roots of Representation.
Thank you for having me, Ed. Happy to be here.
And we're happy to have you here and to get a chance to talk with you. We've invited you to discuss the role that children's museums are playing in efforts to help kids, their families, and their communities prepare for and respond to the threats posed by climate change. In particular, we'd like to hear your ideas as to how organizations like ACM can support informal STEM learning that speaks to the climate-related challenges that Black families and communities are facing. But to start things off, would you share some things about yourself, your work, and your life more generally, and then share what you are seeing as some of the more serious impacts of climate change on Black children and families? So just the informal who you are and what you're thinking.
Sure. So I am a native of Brooklyn, New York, and grew up, early in my life in public housing and, struggled through a number of things, but later through education, came to be in meaningful roles where I could make a contribution, spent a lot of years in higher education before coming to the American Alliance of Museums, I think in 2017, and had a great experience there as executive vice president and working with the team there and working across the museum field. And so that was special. One great thing we did there was initiate something called Facing Change, significant diversity and inclusion initiative. And then 2.5 years ago, came to the American Alliance of came to the Association of Children's Museums from the American Alliance of Museums, and been here 2.5 years and having a great experience. And what, I shared my early beginning in life because it relates to my understanding and commitment to climate and climate change action. And that is because disadvantaged communities are adversely affected by so many of society's ills, but climate change affects our communities even more than others. And I was in a low wealth community, poor community, public housing, and could see as a child, some of the effects of climate change. Our community was unprotected. We didn't have lots of, our community was warmer than the rest of parts of the city. We didn't have the lush, kind of trees and vegetation that you might have. One aspect, there when there was flooding or when there was a storm, we were more adversely affected because we were on lower ground, lower part of the city, if you will, and unprotected in those ways. When we went to school, if it was exceptionally hot or exceptionally cold as a result of climate, again, our schools just were not fully equipped to handle those things. So I've just seen and it's just only gotten worse over the years, especially for disadvantaged communities. So I come to this work supporting children and families and recognizing that we can't truly support the children and families in the ways that we want to, and have them have the success we want them to have without addressing some of these important issues that we're talking about today.
Well, this is really important, and thank you for that background information. And I just want to say how appreciative we are to have your knowledge, skills, and guidance as we work through this project with Black Rep for Kids, because those are the perspectives that we want to emphasize, but we also want to be able to engage with other communities of practice,
Yes.
including informal learning
Yes.
organizations. But next, I want to ask a broad question about the role of museums in combating climate change. So being in the museum world, you see a lot of what's happening around different museum spaces in different communities and even internationally. But at the local level, on the national level, and even at the international level, what kinds of activities are museums getting involved in, especially in terms of the intersection of children, youth, and the environment? And are you seeing a lot of engagement with these topics, and what's really standing out for you?
Sure. So I'd like to start, though, by saying uh, one of the things we do well is provide leadership to our community around issues of importance, we think, to children and families. And one way we provide that leadership is that we included in our strategic plan language about our commitment both to DEAI and to something we called environmental resiliency and regeneration. And that's important to us because that says that then everything we do in our work, each objective, as we implement our plan, will be evaluated through these lenses. Are we being inclusive? In terms of the environment, it means that every decision we make will be considered from a stance of not only doing less environmental harm, but doing more environmental good through our work, right? So that's the organization. So then we come to our conference, and as we have our monthly meetings with our members, we're asking the questions about what are you doing to help around these issues of environmental resiliency and regeneration. And the DEA, the inclusivity piece, goes to the fact that Black Rep for Kids is talking about how we can tell stories and provide information about climate and environment and STEM in an interesting way to specific communities. So both of those fit in. So so we're pushing that out in our conference and to the community. So I can give you examples of what I'm seeing in terms of children, youth, and the environment. Many museums, our museums, children's museums, thrive on having hands-on, interactive, kind of playful learning exhibits. Just this past week, I was in the National Children's Museum in Washington, D.C., and you may know that the National Children's Museum has a lovely exhibit that they call climate heroes, and it is all about trying to expose children and families to climate and the environment in a way that allows them to do something, to think about how their actions affect the climate and the environment, and gives them some ideas and tools to think about how they can be a benefit to the climate and the environment, and gives them ideas about climate-friendly actions they can take at home or at school or in their community. So that's one example that is being exported around the country. That particular exhibit is being moved around the country. But other museums, many of our museums, believe in STEM and STEAM. I can mention another one in Florida, MOZ, the Museum of Discovery and Science, that's led by my board president, Joe Cox. And they have extensive, climate-related exhibits and field trips. I mean, they go out into the Everglades. They take kids on, trips outside the museum, and then they have obviously exhibits in the museum. A lot of work around climate and environment, because again, in places like Florida and certain places that are experiencing sea level rise and extreme weather, they have to explain to kids, this is what's happening, this is why it's happening, and here's how we can help. So I'm seeing many of our museums being creative and innovative around raising these issues, not in a preachy way, but just saying we all want clean air, we want clean water, we want we don't want to be excessively hot or cold. And so what is it that we can do to help address these climate issues that are not coming? They're not coming in years from, they're here now. And you probably, I'm sure you recognize that. I think it was last year was one of the hottest years on record in the United States, if not the world. And because of that, there were situations where children couldn't go out and play on playground equipment because it was just too hot in the summer, to the touch. That's just another real impact of climate and climate change, that we're seeing hotter and hotter summers and years. So, all of this affects children, all this affects families, affects their well-being, if you will. And so I'm seeing our museum step up to raise some of these issues and to help children and communities think about, how they can understand these things, but then what role they can play in ameliorating some of these impacts. Can't stop all of it by yourself, but the little things all of us can do.
Yeah. The other thing that I really appreciate with what you're sharing and what ACM is doing is also helping us to understand the different ways in which communities and people are addressing these issues. The extent to which museums are alike and different in their outreach, I think is important for all of us to hear, because not everyone is going to be doing things with the same focus as others, but everyone is still looking at that guiding light that you described as part of your strategic direction. So I really appreciate the diversity of approaches that are used to incorporate different types of engagement around climate-focused challenges. Let me ask you, are you seeing a lot of attention being devoted to the disproportionate impacts of climate change that we were talking about, in terms of how maker spaces or different kinds of other initiatives within the museum world are centering Black and Brown children's experiences with this? I love the example of the Children's Museum in Washington, but are there other ways you're seeing people begin to talk about this disproportionate side of impact?
So that's an excellent question. And no, I'm not seeing a lot of intentional focus on addressing the disparate impact of these events on disadvantaged communities. I think it's partially because we are in a very politicized environment. Some of our museums and some communities can't even use the words climate and change together without being criticized, because there's some places where there is just not an acceptance of reality and truth. And so our museums are trying to be neutral, if you will, and not focus on, and there are communities where diversity and inclusion conversations, if you use the word DEA, the term DEAI, there's some states, some communities where you are criticized and they're dismantling some of these programs. So I think our museums are trying to be careful of not focusing on disparate communities and how they even talk about climate and the environment. But what we have said to them is that, priority B in our strategic plan says that we are to work to lift up children and families. Well, it's virtually impossible to lift up children and families into the promising paths, educational success, social emotional development, health, and wellness that we want them to have without addressing specifically issues around climate and the environment. And we can't, serve all of the children that we want to serve if we are not addressing those that are more seriously impacted by these things, by calling out disadvantaged Black and Brown communities. So I think this initiative, Ed, will help us, gives us another touch point to reach out to museums to say, we're working on this initiative that focuses on telling these stories, that focuses on these communities, and we are urging you to do that as well. Take some learnings from what we're doing, but also be creative in your own community. So I am going to, along with you and Knowledge and others, continue to urge and encourage our colleagues to be more intentional about raising these issues around all of their communities, but especially those that are most effective. It's like the physicians that talk about triage. that how can we say that we are serving, everyone well if we're not taking care of the most injured? The doctors triage and they take the sickest first because you're most at risk. And so we've got to look at those Black and brown communities and those kids that are most at risk, and start there and see how can we help those in other socioeconomic background areas and other zip codes, have some other natural protections, if you will, against some of these challenges. So my answer is directly no. I don't think we're doing as much as we can to focus specifically on the most disadvantaged communities that are being, having this disparate impact. But I think most of our museums are open to that conversation, and we're going to continue to push for more intentionality in this regard.
Well, the one thing I have to say, to your leadership with ACM and its members is that I've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to talk to different individuals from different museums, and the extent to which multiple entry points for children's understandings about the world
Yes.
is so critical. And yes, we have to continue to work on the issues like we're working on with Black Rep for Kids, but it all has to be grounded in what we know about how children grow, develop, and learn.
Yes.
And so the thing that I'm biased about in terms of the Children's Museum category of informal learning is that people really do have a strong understanding of how you have to have multiple entry points to how children grow, develop, and learn, because that needs to go hand in hand with what it is that we then do with special issues. So I just want to give a shout out to my appreciation. And the other thing is that the organization did announce a strategic plan that prioritizes environmental resilience and regeneration. And for me, it's been useful to have that language as we do our work with Black Rep for Kids, because all children and families who are engaged in trying to learn about the world and what we do as caretakers of the world need to also have this notion of environmental resilience and regeneration. So how would you define these terms, and what inspired the decision to focus on them?
Sure. So while we were building the strategic plan, and I have to give credit to my board for really being open to this conversation, because there was some back and forth about how much we should say about climate and the environment, and should it really be a focus of the Children's Museum Association? And obviously, where we very quickly came to the conclusion, yes, of course it should be. Then how should we talk about it? And we didn't just didn't just want to talk about doing no harm to the environment. So we wanted to talk about how we could be even more proactive in this way. And so, resiliency, we thought we wanted to talk about, okay, how can we help with whatever we did to do no harm to the environment, help our communities be more resilient in terms of how we address the climate change that's happening that we can't stop immediately, but how do we live to it? So the environmental resiliency piece is, it's here, it's happening. How can we, do no harm? And then how can we help our museums and our children and families that we serve to manage through these challenges? But the regeneration piece is that how can we help the earth to heal itself? How can we help the environment to heal it? What can we do not only not to do any harm, but to make it better? And so that's a much more intentional, future-focused kind of language that we wanted to have in there. How can we regenerate the kind of earth, the kind of environment we want that would be, healthy for all people and animals, and we also try to remind our community of what we know from science is that we live in an ecosystem. So we can't succeed in life as humans and be healthy if the bees all die off, right? We can't be healthy as humans and live if the oceans are polluted and the fish die off or full of mercury. So we can't be so selfish as to think that we can, in the effort to raise money and for capitalism pollute the planet and affect all of these ecosystems. And while even if people are making more money in one way or another, even though it's still never equally distributed throughout communities, that's not enough, because we kill the planet. Eventually, all of us will suffer, and eventually humans not only will be affected but are being affected. So we wanted to talk about not only what we do now and today, how we can make it through, how we can be more resilient, and that's maybe an overused word, but it's language we thought was important at the time. But the regeneration piece, I'm real excited about, because makes us ask the question: now, what can we do to help regenerate? One simple example: if all of us just planted more trees, if all of us planted more, vegetation, and we, you know, that's a small thing, but that can help. So there are things that we can do that can help regenerate life and clean air and clean water, in this planet. And so we wanted to lift up that language. And I did want to say, Ed, that one of the things I love about our community is that all of this we know we have to do in an age appropriate manner, that we have to integrate climate change into school curricula, into our informal settings in museums, in a way that helps children and others understand the causes and impacts, as well as the potential solutions. And so our communities are doing community workshops, and we may get to some actions that folk are taking, but I love the age-appropriate nature of our work, and we have museum educators and curators who are just so good taking complex ideas and concepts and breaking them down. I'll give you another example. I was in another museum that had an exhibit where you went into a booth and they had wind swirling that simulated like a hurricane or a big storm. And it was just interesting to immerse yourself in that environment and feel the power of this weather, and then to think about, well, okay, how do these storms occur? Oh, warming seas. And if the seas are warming, why are the seas warming and the polar caps melt? Just that there's a relationship to what we're doing to the planet that then creates these effects that then destroys life and property. And so we are not powerless to address these things if we take a moment to understand them and think about these things. And again, these are not overnight fixes, but the problem wasn't created overnight, and we can slowly repair the problem. And at this point, Ed, not only am I a father, but I'm a grandfather as of the last 6 months. And so I am very concerned that and I'm working to make sure my grandson has a better planet than the one that my children and I were born into.
Wow. Well, you've encapsulated all of the things that I've wanted to encourage in our conversation today, because I want other people to hear this notion of resilience and regeneration within the context of a developmentally appropriate approach to how children see the world and come to care for and about the world and know the world. Because if we don't give them those grounding experiences, why on earth will they be involved in trying to heal the earth?
Yeah.
That's a big lift. But if you're initially engaged in being able to understand and sort of be part of caring for and getting an appreciation for those things in nature
Yeah.
and the earth,
And
you
can I
have
mention
more of it.
something else that I just thought about?
Absolutely.
That was exciting to me. I was in California a week or so, about 2 weeks ago, and one of our museums there, called the Discovery Cube, has an exhibit that's around waste removal and conservation. And what they have done is it's about sustainable living. And they're working to teach children and families about sustainable practices like reducing waste. And but they've made it a gamified process so that children can compete against each other by identifying which kinds of wastes are that can be that how they should be handled and how they should be processed when you're thinking about recycling and et cetera. And so they've got to identify different kinds of trash and waste and where it should go and how it should be processed. And it's gamified. So you get points for saying, oh, this goes here. This is not recyclable. Oh, this is recyclable. This is green. And so at the end, they get recognition. They get their picture on the wall. They're learning about the environment. They're learning about sustainable living. They're having fun. They're having a good time, and they get recognized for it. And I just saw this in action and thought, wow, this is so creative. So it's not just look at this and learn. It's engage and play, have fun, and learn, and get recognition for doing a good job of having learned about waste management and sustainable living and eco-friendly habits. And so I thought that was great. And I talked to that director at Discovery Cube and said, we have to share some of these. You're doing a common thing in an uncommon way. And I think that other museums can learn from that gamification thing. Kids seem to love it, and they've done that in other exhibits. So I just wanted to share that, because what we're trying to do also, Ed, is to take local excellence in various museums like that museum and make it national, kind of practice all around the country. Because if it's effective in reaching kids and families and making the learning joyful, but effective and impactful.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this, and I think that's one of the reasons why the convening that we're going to be having in October is so important. And so hopefully we can get some of those folks involved,
Oh,
because I
yes.
think the interaction from those who are doing hands-on, minds-on work in a developmentally appropriate way are great to be engaged in conversations with behavioral and mental health specialists, with individuals who are working on bringing the conversation to families through picture books, storybooks, whatever, through these kinds of examples that can be anecdotal in one sense, but have a very strong STEM and climate focused undercurrent. So I'm really excited, and that's one of the other reasons why being in partnership with ACM and having you as part of our leadership team is so important, because we need to bring these communities of practice together who don't sometimes talk with each other. And I once again, I just feel that it's really important to lift up what you were talking about. So when you were talking about the role of children's museums, and you included things like playful learning, I was really excited, because I also think about the work you're doing in character education.
Ah, yes, sir.
Because if we don't think about the character that we're building in human beings, that they relate to the children that they're working with, the issues that we're having to face that are sometimes challenging are not always faced with courage and character. So, what are museums promoting in terms of playful learning, character education, and the STEM story world ideas we're talking about? What do you think about that? Top of mind?
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that question. So we do have a new initiative in the children's museum community about. It's called Fostering Character Through Children's Museums. And interestingly enough, and just to say a bit about that, we have always in our community helped our children and families think about things like kindness, right? Play nice in the sandbox and all of that. We're leaning now through this initiative to see how we can introduce some character traits in more creative ways. So curiosity is one we have always pushed and promoted as well, helping kids discover new things through our museums related to the world. But generosity, courage. If you think about climate and environment, that we have to have the courage, first of all, to tell the truth about what's happening. And we have the courage to, in a respectful way, confront colleagues and friends who are doing things to damage our environment, partially because they may not know. Sometimes it's an unthinking kind of thing. I saw a video of some young teenage kids on a boat in some Caribbean island, and they were from the U.S., but they were there on vacation. Beautiful blue waters, and they were just throwing, trash into the ocean just because. And when they were confronted, they said, we were just not thinking. We just sorry, So we've got to confront each other about these issues. Have the courage to do it. So we're talking about those kind of character traits. Also, the playful learning, please, learning through play. First of all, play is learning, full stop. We believe that. We believe all children gravitate toward and need more play. So in our museums, we use a lot of guided play. Guided play has a learning objective. Free play is important, and we have lots of free play, and that's great. But we have a lot of guided play, which has a learning objective. And a lot of those learning objectives then can help children think about subjects like climate and the environment. But again, do it in a way where they're learning, but they're learning through play. And they're doing something that's joyful, and they're doing something that's active, right? And they're doing something that's engaging. So we are good at that. Each year at our conference, we come and share ideas, new ideas for doing that. We have this new initiative that we're doing in conjunction with the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh. They have a facility there called Museum Lab for museum professionals where we test out things. And we've just gotten funding from the IMLS to bring another cohort of museum leaders together to learn to create more exhibits that are more innovative and creative, that address these things, that are playful, that will have greater impact on helping kids learn about not just climate and environment, but other subjects. But how can we be more innovative and creative? We can't just keep, doing the same thing in the same way and expect different results. So we've gotten additional resources to push the envelope. Already do a good job generally of being exhibiting playful learning and these character traits, but coming together do even more, and we're getting funding to do that. And so I'm excited about the character development piece, excited about the Museum Lab for museum professionals with the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh. And all of that, I think, feeds into this conference that we're going to have, where we're going to have focused conversation about, just Black rep for kids and how we can tell stories and how we can promote climate and environment and this whole discussion with communities of color and get those kids excited, in not only learning about themselves and their communities, but maybe even having careers in STEM and STEAM, if you will, because it can be exciting and it should be accessible to them as well.
Those are all of the essential elements that I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to achieve through Black Rep for Kids. And once again, I appreciate and value the way in which you've helped us to and guided us in thinking about that. And the other thing I wanted to say too, with respect to disproportionately impacted communities, there are other things that impact those communities, like academic success, and things having to do with understanding and knowing about those areas where there are careers. So, when you were talking about the importance of free play, it is important, but it's also important to have guided play by informed people, because a lot of times children don't have the background knowledge to make some of the connections that things that we provide for them through curriculum actually, connect with, because no one is really finding out, well, what do you know about in certain things in your community?
Yes.
So there's background knowledge that we have to have as individuals working with children so that we can have guided, playful learning that incorporates what children know, not just what we think they should know. Because a lot of times the assumption is, children should just play. And then you come to some of the communities that I'm familiar with and I grew up in, and the people are askance, and they're saying, well, what are they learning? They're learning how to get along. Yes. And what are they learning? Playful learning with the guided instruction builds on the background knowledge, I think, that we want them to know, whether it's STEM focused. But it also ties into asking the question of the children, well, what do you already know about this?
Yes.
So don't make the assumption that they don't know anything and that their free play is full of all of the things that are in our head that we think they know about. So I really value what it is that we can learn through the individuals who are museum educators and those who work in the informal learning space in general, because that needs to come along with a lot of the other things that are going on in a more formal institution.
Yes. And can I jump in and say something else here before I forget it? Because you said something about, yes, guided play, from those who understand how, to provide those learning objectives and the proper learning objectives and all that. But it also occurred to me that we often talk about in children's museums, having our hands-on interactive experiences and exhibits for children. But our museums increasingly are serving families, and we are increasingly learning that if we don't help the parents and the caregivers to engage as well and to understand brain development and to understand how much happens in the first 3 to 5 years of life, that we're not going to have success. And so I just wanted to say that whatever we do, we also have to talk to parents and caregivers wherever we find them, community groups, churches, other places, and remind them that they are the first teachers, that they have to be intentional about bringing their children into spaces where they can be exposed to some of these positive concepts and experiences, and that the parents, have to be intentional about outside of school and outside of the children's museum, what they do at home. Kids only spend 20% of their time maybe in school, formal education. Then they have weekends, after school, weekends, and what's happening in the home. So we spend increasing amount of time, like some of our museums that have school readiness programs, yes, talking to the kids about social and emotional development, how they can develop, but talking to the parents and caregivers about these are the things we hope you will model at home and help your child to think about at home. And as you go to the grocery store and as you're doing other things, reinforce these conversations about climate and the environment and being regenerative and all of that. So I just wanted to make that point that yes, we're focused on the children and we are focused on exposing them to all kinds of concepts and exciting them and making it joyful. But we also have to give attention to the parents and caregivers if we want our lessons to stick and to continue to have impact.
I'm so glad that you reinforced that, and I think that's really critical, and it doesn't really matter where we're talking about doing this work. It's important. I was talking to someone the other day about the fact that, and I don't know whether there are any museums that are serving communities that are in the Appalachian region, but they're poor white children
Yes.
who don't seem to get, we don't hear much about the care and education that they receive, but that are also in situations where families and children are needing the support for their children to be successful. So for all of us to be successful, I think you've identified some general principles that we should all use about what we know about children's development and learning. And then I was going to ask you, are there any museums or programs serving Black families and communities in disproportionately impacted areas that are doing some things that you're talking about? I mean, because not everybody is in a situation where that can be a primary focus, but there are some places where
Yes.
maybe people are doing some things that do relate to Black families and communities.
Yeah, so I mentioned the National Children's Museum, which is in Washington, D.C., which has a very strong Black and Brown community. And so they do a very good job of attracting and bringing in these communities and school groups and field trips from schools. And so tied to the curriculum, that's one example. Please Touch in Philadelphia does an excellent job, and they have a number of disadvantaged communities that are adjacent to that museum, and they do a great job of reaching out to those communities and bringing those communities into the Children's Museum and exposing them to some of these ideas and concepts. I mentioned a museum in Florida, which is very diverse, certainly many more brown citizens, Hispanic citizens in Florida, as well as Black citizens. And they have been very intentional in reaching out to those communities. And so I'm, thrilled to see that. I mentioned the community in California, the museum there. Also, the museum in St. Louis, the Magic House. The museum is little bit outside the city, so they opened up a maker space downtown St. Louis, so they could reach right in the neighborhood of the most disadvantaged kids, so that they can reach them with STEM and STEAM and all of these concepts around also the environment and climate. And I've been to that facility and seen the excitement in that facility with kids engaging with STEM and STEAM and all kinds of these related concepts. So yes, there are all those examples. And increasingly, the Boston Children's Museum does phenomenal work. I was just talking with that CEO about their outreach in schools and communities, and the things they're doing. And these, especially these coastal museums that are in cities that are close to the ocean, they're affected by these increasing number of storms. They're affected by sea level rise. They're affected by, the excessively hot summers, all of that. And I think they're doing a good job of raising these issues with the community. And I didn't want to forget, before we run out of time, Ed, to say, in all of these things, we have to galvanize our community to support policy advocacy around these issues that promote climate resilience and sustainability at the local, state, and federal levels. And I hope that even as we convene in Charlotte around Black Bread for Kids, we talk about, okay, who will speak for those kids and families, in the City Hall, in the State House, and in Washington, D.C., because yes, we can do things in our communities, but if we don't have policies at the local, state, and federal level that promote climate resilience and sustainability, we're not going to achieve success. And since some of our communities are more affected, we have to raise our voices and make sure that that the Congress knows that we know that these are challenges, because I start to say, unfortunately, most of our folk in Washington, D.C. are wealthy. They're not, they don't live in these disadvantaged communities. So we have to make our voices heard. So I wanted to lift up policy advocacy as something that we all have to do a better job of.
Bravo, because I think that you're actually right about that, and I think that some of the other things that you're sharing with us today are examples of what I hope we're able to talk about during our convening in October, because storytelling
Yes.
about the very things that we're talking about today help people to understand that we really are represented in things that people are doing to make a difference. Because what got me interested first in doing this work was the fact that there was a lot of conversation going on over the past 3 or 4 years with different initiatives to help us understand the importance of looking at climate. And it included the fact that there was a diverse range of people who were impacted by it. But my concern was primarily that when the discussion was about Black and brown kids, it was about primarily their being victims, which many of the children and families are.
Yes.
But they also should be looked upon as having some hope, because there are solutions builders. And some of those solutions builders are working in these museums or working in the field of STEM and climate change. And so we need to give voice and visibility, I think, to the fact that we are also engaged in building solutions and not just victims of the impact. Because
Yes.
self-efficacy, I think, is related to what you were talking about earlier in terms of people being able to support and advocate. But if you don't see yourself as being part of a solution or an advocacy approach, you're not going to be able to be very effective in communicating that. So
Yes.
I think storytelling methods that we use to share these stories, whether they're picture books, storybooks, and I'm staying away from things like the animated films, because everything starts with a story.
Yes.
Whether you turn it into to an app, whether you turn it into gaming, or whether you turn it into a film, or whether you turn it into something that you sit on, that a child sits on your lap and you read to.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
important. So how do you think children's museums can work in tandem, for example, with authors and illustrators and storytellers and climate science educators, to help children and their families learn about these different kinds of environmental risks across these different communities? So that's beginning to bring some of the
Sure.
people that we're talking about who help create these
Yeah.
approaches.
Yeah, I think first thing that our museums can do more of is to bring some of these artists and others into the museum, and storytellers into the museum, to talk about what they do, how they do what they do, and how they engage with the climate and environment, and how they and to tell some of those stories to the children and families. So I think more direct engagement and involvement with some of those individuals in our museums will help and make a difference. One of the other things I think that we can do is to do things in our museums that will empower young people to lead climate action projects, right? Such as whether it's community cleanups or tree planting or educational campaigns. Because in one of our museums, there's an exhibit called "The Power of Children," and one of the children they have they focus on is Ruby Bridges, who integrated schools. Malala Yousafzai, who talked about education. Ryan White, who was eloquent about his challenge with AIDS. But I was impressed with how these young people, and let's take Malala Yousafzai, who through great challenge and threat to herself lifted up the issue of education for girls. Why couldn't we help facilitate some Black and brown youth to talk about and learn about climate action projects in their communities, because of the impact is so disparate in their communities? And children's museums can help empower some of those young people, remind them of the agency they have, give them that facility, connect them with some of these community artists and others, and help them to create some campaigns, educational campaigns, projects, and that sort of thing. So we're looking, and coming out of hopefully this meeting in Charlotte, Black Rep for Kids, of having some toolkits and models for how that can happen in our communities, because I do think that it makes a difference if we get more young people, some youth-led initiatives, and not just the adults talking, to the kids, having them talk to each other.
You're hitting some areas that I think are also bringing. When you mentioned before about the fact that we're dealing with children, youth, and families, but we're also looking at the impact that young people can have in peer-to-peer
Yes.
relationships. Younger children and older children. There are things that some of those community outreach efforts can do that can really engage youth in ways in which they can be involved, but also ways in which they can reach to their younger siblings and cousins and whatever, and model what they're learning. And the perfect place to do that, I think, is through the museum itself, because of I think the draw that it can have.
Yes.
And I just want to say that, you mentioned earlier about, the times that we're in right now make it difficult to have certain kinds of conversations about certain topics. But I think what you've also helped us to understand is that by engaging in engaging children and families in things that they can see, they can touch, they can feel, they can talk about. You don't have to lead with the with the fiery term. You can lead with, what do you think will happen if? And so, if that's making an informal census count of trees in a 3-block area, and what do you think trees do? What do you think trees bring to the health and well-being of a community? That can be a conversation that has nothing to do with whether or not that we have trees or they're dying or whatever because of climate change. It's what can we do to be stewards of the earth, as you said. So are you seeing climate researchers and media creators engaging with children's communities more? And how could working with scientists and writers and illustrators deal with this intersection of youth, climate, and inclusion that you're
Yeah,
talking about?
I think we have some examples of that, with scientists coming into museums and working. I know that we brought. I mean, I'm actually speaking to you from Houston, Texas, and I've been today, and I've been to Space Center Houston and the Children's Museum here in Houston, and they have brought scientists, astronauts, others in. And bringing astronauts in has been interesting because they talk about their view and perspective of the Earth and get a different appreciation for the environment and climate and weather and climate effects when they see the planet from space. So that's just one example of how we brought scientists in to tell those stories about their experiences and helping us to better appreciate our climate and our environment. But I think we should be more intentional about that and how we can bring more of scientists in to tell stories about the environment. And we have to be, there are people who are knowledgeable, but who are not good communicators, who don't tell the stories well. So we do have to find those knowledgeable people who can tell the story well. And related to that, I wanted to mention something, Ed, that we're working on in our community. Um, Mental health support, that we want to provide resources for coping with the emotional impacts of climate change, such as anxiety and stress. We can't minimize the impacts on children. The American Academy of Pediatrics calls it toxic stress. And there are many things that create this kind of stress on children and families. Again, we can bring experts in, scientists and others, again, and through storytelling that can help maybe address even some of these mental health challenges and emotional impacts of climate change. But I didn't want to forget that, because sometimes we think the effects are just, physical, but they're mental and emotional as well. And that's equally important and affecting, many in our community.
Well, I'm glad that you raised that, because that's one of the reasons we're really grateful to have our leadership and advisory team, Dr. Tresha Gibbs, who is a child psychiatrist here in New York and deals with family practice, really is emphasizing that as well. So we're hoping that that cross-disciplinary conversation in October is going to help us to bring to life many of the things that are in the vision that you have through the work that you do at ACM, and to help us to be able to build upon those kinds of things that that I believe ACM is and its members are already demonstrating. Before we let you go, I wanted to ask about any other individuals, groups, or resources that you know about we should be aware of. And if there are people or resources, we'll be including those in our resource library. But any particular ones come to mind that you really hope we're working with, or that you hope are there in October?
Well, I know that we're casting a wide net to make sure that we bring in a variety of folks. So we certainly will have representation from our community. I think there are other organizations. I know you have been engaged with NACI, and I have getting more engaged with them as well. I think they're a great group. I love what Dr. Leah Austin is doing with her organization, National Black Child Development Institute, and I know they'll be involved. So I think those kinds of grassroots organizations that are in education, early childhood, child development, I think we just need to keep reaching out and finding more of those as potential partners, because I think we only will succeed if we collaborate. We've got to collaborate and bring a number of voices together and resources together, human and otherwise, to address this issue. So I think you've got a good group. We're going to bring our team. Our community will be represented at the meeting and conference in Charlotte. So I think we're in good shape, Ed. And I was talking with Jen just this morning about reaching out to a few others to make sure we have the kind of representation we need.
Well, listen, you've provided us with some essential information and perspectives to think about as we build this STEM-related knowledge into children's climate change literature and hands-on experiences, as well as the focus we have on Black Rep for Kids. So, Arthur Affleck, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today on our Roots of Representation podcast.
You're very welcome, and I just will leave you with these words. Mother Teresa said, if you can't feed 100, then feed just one. If you can't, save the whole ocean, then maybe save your lake. Or if you can't do that, then at least plant a tree. But there's something all of us can do around our environment. Love yourself, love your kids, and fully engage. And thank you, Ed, for the great work you do.
Well, thank you. And we'll look forward to continuing the conversation with you as our project continues. And thank you to our listeners. We'll look forward to talking with you again. Thanks for listening to Roots of Representation. If you'd like to comment on this episode, please head over to blackrepforkids.knowledge.org. Our website also contains free resources and more information about the project, which is led by Knology in collaboration with the Highlights Foundation, the National Black Child Development Institute, the Association of Children's Museums, and a panel of nationally recognized advisors. Remember, Black Rep for Kids isn't just a podcast. It's an essential part of the project's culminating experience, which will be a 2-day unconference event held in fall 2024. Head over to the website to register now. And in the meantime, let's keep the conversation going. You can also share your ideas and resources for amplifying Black voices and stories in children's STEM literature at blackrep4kids.knowledge.org. Roots of Representation is produced by ABF Creative, an award-winning podcast network that creates cultural and emotional connections through podcasts. The series is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program under grant number 2314101. Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this podcast series are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. Roots of Representation, the podcast centering Black climate story worlds for young minds.